I've worked as a registered land surveyor since I was 17 years old. There was one job outside Phoenix in the 90s that scared the bejesus out of me. I was doing a survey for a series of huge developments well outside the community, probably 25 miles from the city limits. I got out there about 5 a.m., so I'd have a decent amount of time to work before the temperatures got past 100 degrees. Surveying in the desert is miserable. Don't let anyone tell you different. Much of the work involved bushwhacking and hill busting, walking tens of miles in uncharted terrain, particularly during this time period. Every single part of the desert was being developed around Phoenix, no matter if it was rugged or overgrown. People were buying it, slicing it up, then dropping the framework for future cities. Back then, areas were just lots and hills, but now are some of the busiest metropolitan areas in the state. When I arrived at the job, I did the first thing that all surveyors do, which is assemble base camp. Surveying is anchored to satellites, GPS, and exact coordinates. You need a hub set up to relay all the data to come back to. Sometimes you'll see a tripod with a box and antenna on top, a crate on the ground with some wire running between them, all that good stuff. I would go out with a GPS rod and send coordinates back to base camp. Everything got set up and I went about my day. It was harsh and unforgiving terrain, and the Arizona sun beat down on me like a hammer on a nail. I kept more equipment than I needed to, which slowed my pace even more. Magnetized metal detector, hatchet, hammer, bush knife, rope, hand shovel, and of course, a .32 caliber pistol stuffed inside my boot. It was mostly for snakes or coyotes in the early hours. I didn't see the sense in keeping a big heavy gun that I might lose when a cheap little one would do. All of this stuff was either hanging from my belt or a backstrap that I kept slung across my body. You never know what you might need when you find a property corner. Some of them are buried under 18 inches of dry, impacted soil. You can't even get through with a shovel, hence the hatchet and hammer. You have to chew away at it, one chisel swing at a time. Once it loosens up, the hand shovel comes into play. Anyway, it must have been around 10 in the morning when I crested a hill. Saw a bridge way off in the distance. Nothing special, but a low little thing out in the middle of nowhere. It seemed to serve as an old ranch road, just a concrete port, probably 12 feet tall. I gave it exactly zero thought as I huffed to the next checkpoint. I was already through the first property and onto the next lot. If I kept my pace going, I could have the whole job done by 2 p.m. The hillside I was now descending proved pretty challenging, but I could see a big gulch waiting for me at the bottom. I'd have to drop into it with all of my equipment, then climb up the other side, every inch of the way, blanketed with razor underbrush and cactus, scorpions, rattlesnakes, and the elusive Gila monster. A chance encountering with anything like that could prove fatal. For those that don't know, the Gila monster is Arizona's miniature Komodo dragon. It's one of the only poisonous lizards in the world. They're known for being aggressive. I can tell you that from experience. It isn't the toxicity from the bite that's going to kill you. It's the disorientation. The swelling and burning gets you first, then the nausea, and soon, the rapid change in blood pressure makes you dizzy. You don't know your ass from your elbow. Forget about finding direction. You can barely walk. Once you get bit, hiking back to your truck is impossible if it's further than a couple of miles. The sun will kill you after that. That's the kind of stuff that would preoccupy my mind when I pushed through particularly overgrown areas. It was thick and uneven ground, and by the time I reached the ravine, my arms were sliced to ribbons from the thorns. I could barely breathe from the heat. It didn't matter though. Not to be a big shot, but this line of work makes men into metal. I dropped into the sandy gulch, wiped my brow, and started climbing up the other side. I could have wandered up or down either direction, found a spillway, but I needed to walk the property line as close as possible. I tagged 2 more points with GPS before I got out of the underbrush. It was spiderwebbed with all kinds of dumpy little creek beds, constantly making me go up and down. By the time it spit me into a dust bowl, I was ready for a break. And with just my luck, that bridge I saw earlier was only a quarter mile or so away. It was literally the only shade available for who knows how many godless miles out here. The bridge now became my mission. I could feel the skin on my neck blistering so quickly that my skin was just peeling away rather than burn. I get skin cancer removed from some part of my body at least once every couple of years. It's just part of the trade. The guys I really feel bad for are the ones that can't tan. I get dark, but some guys just burn and burn, perpetually pink like a boiled lobster. As I get close to the underpass, I can see there's an object under there already, something big. It's not until I get within a few hundred yards, I make out that it's a dumpster. Again, I didn't think anything of this. This is a desert ranch land out here. A dumpster by the bridge makes sense in my mind. Almost seemed bustling for out there. Once I get within 25 yards, the weirder details start to present themselves. Firstly, there seems to be some kind of scripture written all over the outside of the dumpster. Then I see the tracks in the dirt and sand. They stretch out as far as I can see, until they disappear into the desert. I'm still walking as I put this together. This thing wasn't dropped off, it was pushed out here. And if you remember correctly, I'm more than 20 miles away from anything reminiscent of a city. Whoever pushed this thing, they pushed it for days, maybe weeks to get it where it was. The only spot of shade in the whole area. I stepped under the bridge and started unloading my equipment. I can't describe to you how it felt to get the sun off my back, like I escaped certain death. I only took a few slugs from my canteen and discarded that as well. The plan was to sit and breathe for a few minutes before rounding the last segment of the last property. Behind me, I hear one of the plastic covers on the dumpster flip open and slam into the steel body, followed by a scraping sound. I turned around just in time to see a man emerge from the darkness of that container. He looked like a psycho, bald, and with clearly a DIY shave job, cuts and nicks all over his scalp. He's standing straight up in the mouth of the dumpster, his hands down in the steel container, where they continue to make that scraping sound. Before I can react, the guy grabs the lip of the container and leaps out of it like a stuntman. It was like he flew through the air for a moment. It caught me so off guard that in my attempt to backpedal, I tripped up over my boots and equipment and landed flat on my ass. The idea of calling someone didn't even occur to me. There was a car phone in my truck, but that was 5 or 6 miles away, maybe further. I was on my own with this guy, and I'd clearly stepped into his territory. When I fell down, the guy got really excited, started waving the thing around he was using to make that scraping noise. It was a 16-inch screwdriver that had the top inch broken off, leaving just a warped, twisted hook of metal. It looked like a goddamn sword at first glance. He crouched low, almost eye level with me, then started coming for me, arms outstretched, weapon before him. His face was every shade of crazy that you can imagine, eyes bulging out of his head, dried blood down his chin, and muttering this indiscernible language. I scrambled backward as quickly as possible, doing a half crab walk to create a little distance. It wasn't quick enough though. This guy was on top of me in a second, waving his screwdriver and trying to hit me in the head. If he jumped on me, I'd be out of moves, and gravity would give him the advantage in stabbing me. I did the one thing that I thought might work. I reached for my boot and yanked out that little black pistol. I held it barrel up so he could see the full frame, then pointed it right in his dirty face. He froze up, just like I wanted him to, and took a couple of steps back. With one hand posted behind me, I jumped to my feet and moved backward until I hit my back on the wall. I didn't know if this guy had any friends out here. I had already been surprised once. It sure as hell wasn't happening again. With the nature of our Mexican standoff, the guy found some words. He asked me what I was doing out there. I told him I was working. I was a surveyor. I was not interested in disturbing him. The whole interaction was an accident. I even offered him an apology. I'm not heartless. I know a guy down on his luck when I see him, but he was also coming at me with a short sword. If it's going to be one of us to get killed, it's going to be the other guy every time. That's just how I was raised. I asked how long he'd been living out here, which he shrugged and started laughing. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was just something off about him, beyond the normal homeless demeanor. Phoenix in the 90s had one of the largest homeless camps in the country, so I was used to seeing these kind of folks in my line of work. This guy was different. I looked back over to the dumpster, and the weird scripture all over it. I don't know why, but it made me think of the movie The Exorcist. This guy's jerky movements reminded me of The Possession. He went over to the equipment I discarded and started rifling through it. I uttered the sternest warning that I could. All of that stuff was very expensive, and unless he wanted trouble, he better leave it alone. He shrugged and gave me a growl and kept poking through it. He didn't take anything, but he sized up every little item, like each thing was the holy grail. After he was satisfied, he tucked the screwdriver in his pants, dropped on all fours, then crawled back into the dumpster. At this point, I shuffled down the bridge wall until I was back out underneath the sun. I watched him crawl back into the dumpster, with the lid closed, but he kept watching me. The plastic lid stayed open by just a couple of inches, and in the shadows, I could see his eyes and forehead. He watched me the whole time I gathered my stuff. Against my better judgment, I continued on. I finished the job by afternoon. I circled the bridge as I did, at a healthy distance varying between 1 to 2 miles. You better believe I kept an eye out for that weirdo, or anyone else skulking around. That was one of those jobs where rattlesnakes and other desert dangers took the backseat to a truly unpredictable danger. I saw him get out once or twice, throwing a fit in the shadows beneath the bridge. At one point, I think he was throwing rocks against the steel shell. When I hit my last coordinate and started back toward my truck, I saw something even stranger. My new friend had pushed his dumpster out from underneath the bridge, was apparently setting sail. I watched him continue to push that thing through rocks and sand, using boards to navigate the more uneven terrain. It was an absolutely wild thing to see, true innovation. Too bad it was wasted on such a strange errand. I returned to that area sporadically over the next year for additional coordinate data, but I never saw that man again. I want to start this off by saying 2 things. First, I'm not much of a writer, so I'm going to try to keep all of this simple and straight to the point. The other thing, I don't believe in ghosts or spirits of any kind, so you'll have to come to your own conclusion about this experience that we had. I grew up in a small town in the Southwest, not desert but heavily forested high country. When I was in high school, me and some of my friends heard a rumor from upperclassmen. The rumor was that there was a condemned cabin somewhere in the woodland outside of town. It was known as the Indian Slaughterhouse. The upperclassmen spreading this rumor heard it earned its name during the town's settling in circa 1800. Any natives that resisted moving to the local reservation were dragged out to this cabin and mercilessly tortured, if not killed. I know what you're thinking. This is the most politically incorrect legend you've ever heard. Well, this was 20 years ago, before kids were as considerate as they are today. The thing is, some adults around this town found old newspaper clippings that actually corroborated the story that we heard. There was an old shack that was known as the Native Conversion Camp. When we heard this, some of my friends became a lot more interested. We actually liked the idea of a local haunt, but the fact that it might have some historical accuracy, that was next level. At the time, only one of my friends was old enough to drive, so a few of us piled into his old Chevy Blazer and started tooling around the forest back roads in search of that cabin. It took us most of a semester, but after searching enough ground and asking around, we got a lead. Another group of kids had came upon the dilapidated cabin out northeast of town, a couple of miles beyond the last neighborhood. They said you had to park at the end of a dead-end dirt road, then walk for about a half a mile. We knew the road that they were talking about, decided to check it out for ourselves. There were 4 of us that went. We turned the car around when we parked so we could leave quickly if needed. We had flashlights and a couple of pocket knives, your standard high school boys' adventure equipment. My buddy locked his car up and we walked over as a unit, over to where we were told the trail began. Sure enough, we can see the beginnings of a little path that leads inside the wilderness. It's down a steep but short slope. Beyond that, looks relatively flat. Still, no one advances down the initial hillside because it's so rugged and final. Once you commit to walking down that slope, there's no turning around. So if anything happens down there, we're committed. I remember taking a deep breath and looking around the forest. Because of the decline, I was looking 10, maybe 15 feet up the tree trunks because of the ground level difference. They were swaying gently, but there wasn't any wind. The sun was setting so fast that I could see the shadows overtaking the forest. What was twilight when we arrived was rapidly becoming darkness. It was creepy. I didn't like it. But in that moment, something occurred to me. This was all too perfect. Some dumb seniors gave us a tip to come check out this particular stretch of woodland. There's no traffic, no quick escape. I suddenly envisioned a group of douchebags hidden in the foliage below, waiting to scare the crap out of us after we started looking around. It was the exact kind of prank I would pull on my little sister. Now that I created doubt for myself, descending down the slope didn't seem as intimidating. I took a deep breath and took my first step, and then impulsively shouted something that I regret to this day. As I'm making my way down that treacherous hill, I yelled at the top of my lungs, "All right, you stupid ghost, show me what you got." Several things happened the moment I spoke. The first and most obvious was the screaming that suddenly came out of the forest in front of me. It wasn't just one voice, not two or three. It sounded like dozens of different pitches, all screaming, all layered together at once. There were so many voices, it sounded distorted to me. But that could have been the shock. There was so much sound that it took my breath away, made me freeze up in panic. When that screaming started, the trees started thrashing like there was a nautical gale blowing around. Like I said before, there wasn't any wind of any kind. Still, a sudden motion lent to the idea of wind, and for some reason made me feel like I was drowning. Besides the trees, nothing else moved down below. No people, no bodies. Denial has taken over my mind at this point. I'm sure this whole thing is still a prank. What else could it be? There must be 10, maybe 20 fellow students out here, hiding amongst the trees, shaking them, and screaming, all just to get a reaction out of us. I turned back to my friends to explain this to them, that we've been set up, and whoever did it did a great job. When I see the top of the slope, I find I'm alone. My friends had turned tail and were bum rushing back to the blazer, fully intending on leaving me out there. The denial in my brain unravels. I realize there aren't any other cars parked out here. No one is laughing or saying gotcha. There is no prank. Whatever just happened, as strange as it may have been, it was real. I start to panic climb my way back to the road, just in time to see my buddies running so quickly that they're falling headfirst into dirt. I can hear them screaming, even crying, desperate to get away from that tree line. Fortunately for me, my friends were too scared to get the keys in the ignition, so I jumped in the back seat before they could bail on me. We locked the doors and caught our breath, listened to the chaos outside die down into silence. I asked them if this was a setup. They all told me no. At this point, I'm looking everyone in the eye, demanding to know if there's anyone out there messing with us. All of them are teary-eyed and adamant. None of this is planned. After a few minutes of collecting ourselves, we start talking about what to do. One of my friends, the guy that drove, really wants to leave and come back when it's daytime. The rest of us are kind of here for the crazy. We want to at least go see the cabin. It takes a good amount of convincing, but we all finally agree and get back out of the car. I offer to lead the charge down the initial slope, but everyone agrees to go down together as a unit. We take slow, deliberate steps to the forest floor, this time not yelling any kind of challenge. There wasn't any screaming, there wasn't any wind. We made it down unscathed, and because of that, I gained a little confidence. Now, from what the seniors had told us, we needed to follow the trail in a big loop. They said it was a horseshoe-shaped trail that would take us to the cabin. It would be such a wide loop that after the halfway point, we would feel like we were walking in the wrong direction. They assured us to press on and keep going until we saw a building by a dry creek bed. The walk took about 10 minutes. Part of it felt exactly as they said it would. It was like we had somehow swung around. We were walking right back toward where we left the car. As we pushed through this last stretch, we could hear footsteps in the fallen leaves around us. The forest was washed in moonlight at this point, but the canopy cast shadows all over. The result made us think that we saw things, but looking back, I really don't think we did. Either way, after the last bend, there was the cabin. A big, blocky building with a wide-angled roof. A rocky creek bed ran in either direction just behind it, just as the upperclassmen said. The building was totally sealed up, and by that I mean there wasn't any glass. It looked all boarded up there in the dark. We made a lap of it first, just to get an idea of the area and possible exits, and if anyone was around. We'd also heard a story about a big pool behind that cabin, where those torturers would wash the blood from their tools. To our surprise, there really was a bored out area in stone, where water would gather in a perfect little basin. At this point, one of my friends tells us a story that he heard from his older brother. His brother and his group of friends had come out here once. While they were exploring the cabin, there were hooves walking around through the creek, which had very little water in it. There was splashing and everything, so it had to be real. They went outside expecting to see an elk or a deer, but instead, he said they found a horse and a rider in the dark. The person never looked up as he rode on by, slender and shirtless in the dark. Naturally, they all thought it was the ghost of a Native American. I think they made it up though, but who really knows? It could have been a real horse rider. We live in a rural area with lots of ranches and farms. After inspecting the outside, which it did have a little graffiti, you know the kind. Satanic 666s, pentagrams, all of that. We opened up the front door. It looked boarded up, but it was actually just really old. The oldest style of door I've ever seen. It swung right open, and inside we found exactly what we imagined. Rusty chains hanging from pegs in the ceiling. Rusted tools like saws and clamps hanging from walls. All still intact and present. The very few that have found this cabin had also left its twisted history behind for others to see. It turned out the windows weren't actually boarded up. They were just really old, that you could either push open for fresh air and sunlight, or pull and chain close at night to keep the cool weather out. It was primitive to say the least, bare bones type of architecture. We gave ourselves a little tour, shared more stories that we'd heard over the years. There was more random satanic graffiti, a small fire pit in a back room, and evidence of drug use, needles and other stuff. Aside from that, we didn't hear or see anyone else in the building. At one point, everyone is sharing stories. For some reason, one of my friends decides it's a good idea to open palm smack one of the slat covers that opens one of the windows. When we asked later why he did that, he said it was an impulsive thing, to see how sturdy it was after all those years. Right after he initially smacked it, it all made us jump. We turned to face the wood paneling. When we saw his hand there, we all let out a sigh of relief. But in that second, something smacked the paneling from the other side, in the exact same place. My buddy pulled his hands back. His eyes got huge. He said he could feel the vibration throughout the wood. After a moment of listening, we actually unslung the chain and pushed over the covers so we could see through the window. There's nothing out there. No person, no ghost. We did hear another bang come from the far side of the house, and at which point we all decided it was time to go. It was a long trek back to the car. We jumped at every little sound and shadow along the path. We heard the same footsteps in the leaves, except this time it sounded like people running right on top of us. We'd whirl around, flashlight in hand, and see no one there, not even a leaf out of place. We got to the hill slope, and this time allowed one person to climb at a time, the rest of us standing guard. I was last and ran up the ridge as fast as my legs would let me. We got into the car and made our escape with little issue. The only other thing that happened was when we came to the end of the dirt road that intersected with pavement, there was a fully intact elk skeleton lying in the road. It was white, stripped clean, had clearly been dead for years. That thing hadn't been here an hour or two earlier when we drove through. This was the only road to get back to the cabin, so we were sure it had been placed since our arrival. The only real guess that made any kind of sense was that it slid out of the back of someone's truck, but even then, that seemed pretty far-fetched. We hadn't heard any other engines in the area, hadn't seen headlights, and even then, why would their bed be open? It was weird, but we just drove around it and left. We came back the next week to see if it was still there, and there wasn't even a fragment of it left in the road. Here's a little bonus for being here this long. Me and my other friend who went out to that cabin that night still live in the same town. He became a firefighter, and I work in education. He told me that he responded to a call out there within the last couple of years. There was a report of a dead body in the forest, the area he knew as Slaughterhouse. He and his team arrived to find a younger white male, deceased, likely homeless, with strangulation marks around his neck. He was within 100 yards of that cabin. I have absolutely zero proof relating this incident to the other, but we both thought it was too weird to be just a coincidence. The cabin has since collapsed into itself in the last 10 years, and we've not taken the time to go back and visit. So as a kid around 11 or 12, I had the world on my plate. We have these woods around us that I never ever came close to finding the edge of. I would wake up in the morning early when school was out, and my friend Alex and I would spend the whole day mucking around those woods. We would pack sandwiches and sodas, just go nuts, play army and war, cowboys and Indians, you name it. This being the 80s, Alex and I being smart enough kids, my parents had no problem with this and enjoyed taking us to the army surplus store to buy stuff like MREs and survival knives and camping gear. It's pretty regular that we'd be allowed to stay out overnight if my dad was out there to help us set up camp and close to the property. We daydreamed all kinds of crazy stuff, discovering hidden treasure or uncovering fossils of some unbelievable creature. Maybe we'd find the wreckage of an airplane or strike it rich with gold in one of the dry riverbeds. The possibilities were endless out there. We made sure to take full advantage of. The honest truth was there really wasn't much of anything out there besides our relentless imagination. One day, after a whole morning of playing, we find a treehouse in the part of the woods we've never been to before. Probably a 2-hour trek from the edge of the neighborhood, maybe 2 or 3 miles at most. It was hilly and rocky. Seriously, a kid's dream. This treehouse was probably 30 feet off the ground, but it looked solid. We're stoked to find a new castle. We hightail it back to get some rope, and my pops takes us down to the surplus store. Over dinner, Alex and I just can't shut up about it. The next day comes. We hike out at almost dawn. We get a full backpack of rope and sandwiches and our knives on our hips. The excitement that's so thick we could chew on it. We finally make it out there, and we start attaching rungs made of big sticks onto one end of the rope. It took us a good few hours, but we finally got one side finished, and the rope tossed over the branch. That's where the little deck and the door are. We finally climb up and are sitting on the deck, looking out, playing rock, paper, scissors for who gets to go in first. Alex wins, goes in and comes right back out. He's white as a sheet, wants to go home. I'm curious, so I go inside next. This treehouse is probably 8 by 8, 7 to 8 feet high inside. The inside walls are covered, every single inch of naked girls. Not some awesome Playboy porn, but kiddie porn. I think the oldest kids were about my age. It was Polaroids, glossy magazine pages, stuck perfectly up with staples and filling the entire wall up. When I exited the treehouse, I had a super nauseous feeling. When I looked at Alex, I felt even worse. He was staring at something off in the distance. He looked terrified. I followed his gaze, and sure enough, there was a flashlight bobbing through the trees toward our location. My knees gave out. I struggled to get myself over to the ladder, whispering for Alex to follow me. It took a moment, but he snapped out of it, and we scrambled down the rope as quickly as we could. As we touched down, the light from the approaching person was reaching through the underbrush and actually now touching me. I couldn't see it through the branches and overgrowth, but the fact that they were so close was panic-inducing. I waved for Alex to follow me. We just managed to get out of sight in time. Some guy walked into the clearing, froze in place when he saw our little ladder dangling from the deck above. He knew someone had been inside his freak show treehouse. exit Alex and I, getting back home as quickly as we could. At first, we ran quietly, at least until we were sure that guy wasn't following us. It was like twilight or so when he came upon us, so between brush and the coming darkness, everything kind of worked out in our favor. We informed my dad about it, and he called the police. The officer showed up and asked us a few questions like where it was, how did we get up there, where did we get the rope, did we take any pictures off the wall. He got increasingly rude about it until my dad put an end to it. He left with our statement and said he would be in touch. We were no longer allowed to take overnights in the woods or be out there for more than an hour without checking in. We actually built a really long tin can phone with permission from my parents, which allowed us a little bit more of our freedom, but we were pretty cut off from deep exploring. After a year or two later, that same cop stopped me when I was hanging out in a different park, saw me smoking and caught me with a joint. Alex asked him whatever happened in that treehouse. Cop told us not to do drugs and then just left us alone. In college, many moons later, Alex sent me an email saying how he read in the big state paper, towns that are, say, the county seat have their own papers, but the capital city has a big paper. That the officer shot himself with his service revolver after his wife found out he was circulating CP. So it comes to my mind, like it came to Alex's, that we found his little CP stash or cave. The creepy part came months later. Alex sent me another email saying that he went to the estate auction. One of the items for sale was a rope ladder with a bag. That's the creepiest story of me out in the woods that I have, folks. It still grosses me out and sends chills down my spine. I was on a road trip for work a couple of years ago, and most of that took me right into the middle of nowhere. One big stretch through New Mexico into Texas, through lots of little scuzzy towns that I can't recall the names of. There's one incident that happens that goes down as the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. Cut straight to the scene. I'm on day 4 of the drive, and I'm making pretty good time. On this particular day though, I'd woken up late, so I got a late start. It's about sundown when I'm running out of gas, getting ready to stop like usual, except I've only actually been driving for 6 hours when I planned on driving for 9 or 10. I hadn't made the progress that I wanted to, so I decided to gas up and push on through the night. Many of these dusty highway towns have 24-hour accommodations, so I really wasn't worried about finding a hotel somewhere. I roll into a gas station maybe 30 minutes later, just before I got the e-message on my dashboard. I park my truck, stretch my legs, and check my phone. As I'm doing this, I notice a guy sitting on the ground near the entrance to the gas station. He looks homeless, but he also looks upset. It's hard to explain. He just had this deep-seated frown on his face. Tried not to look at him and just went about my business. I moved some stuff around in the backseat of my truck, double-checked my belongings, all the regular road trip stuff. I heard a sound behind me. I turn around to find the homeless guy. Here's the thing, he must have been close to 7 feet tall, the largest man I've ever seen. Not particularly bulky, just towering with big features. Big hands, big nose, big head. The rest of him was just like dirty and slender. He had some loose belongings, a blanket and an armload of various items. He asked me for a ride in the deepest voice I've ever heard. It was frightening in the sense that I felt truly powerless. This guy was so big he didn't even seem human to me, and he wanted a favor. How the hell do I say no to that? I don't think that was part of his plan. He just used his size to kind of force the answer that he wanted. I didn't cave though. I told him I'm sorry. I'm on the clock and it's a work truck. No passengers allowed, and even said so on the insurance. None of this was true, but it sounded like an official mumbo-jumbo answer. Figured he'd get me out of any further request. The guy just kind of nodded and then moved out of my way. I apologized again and then said I passed a number of vehicles headed this way. Surely someone will help you out. In my panic to get away from this monster of a man, I just kind of barreled into the convenience store to pay for my gas in person. This seemed like a perfectly logical thing to do, when in reality, I was just creating steps so I could be near another person. I got a big bag of jerky, a bottle of soda, and 16 gallons of premium. I asked about the guy outside and the clerk just shrugged, so I went on my merry way. When I got back into my truck, that guy was nowhere to be found, not even in his spot by the door. I put my stuff in my truck and dribbled the gas in the tank. Kept an eye out in every direction for that 7-foot-tall hitchhiker. I didn't see him, so I pushed on. Drove until 9 p.m., something like that. I was finally tired, and I'd put the distance behind me that I so desired. I rolled into some border town, secured a hotel room, and even found a little hole-in-the-wall bar that was still serving dinner. It was a dingy little wannabe Italian spot, built inside a double-wide trailer. It had a low red light, vaguely racist decor on the walls, but was warm and the food smelled amazing coming out of the kitchen. I settled in, ordered a beer, and then just zoned out on my phone. By my count, I'd still gone over a little 200 miles since I stopped at that gas station. I was right on schedule still, all was well. As I'm going over the map, I hear some incredibly heavy footsteps creak up the stairs and onto the porch of that bar and grill. They make their way to the door, which swings open. I see the frame of that homeless guy that was at the station. All I can see is his chest and shoulders because his head is too high for the door frame. He ducks down and creeps his way into the bar, shuts the door behind him. No one really says anything, but everyone gives them this lingering look as he strolls over to the bar. I don't really think anything of this at first, until I remembered the distance that I just crunched. This guy should be sitting under a flickering fluorescent light some 200 miles behind me, yet here he was, like he rode in the passenger seat of my truck. That's when it clicked. I watch as the bartender tells him he can have any table he likes. The guy takes one right in front of me. He's practically staring at me with a grin over the top of my phone. When we had our encounter, I got into the gas station earlier. This guy must have climbed into the bed of my truck. When I exited the gas station, I must have been so spooked that I was keeping an eye out around me, not really inspecting my truck at all. He probably just laid down flat that whole damn way, and I had no idea. He gave me a wink, as if to confirm my internal reasoning. There was literally no other logical way that he could be here. I scarfed down the food I ordered, slammed a beer, and left the bar as quickly as possible. The hitchhiker ate a big bowl of spaghetti in true psychotic fashion, just staring me down the whole time. It was a long, sleepless night in my hotel room. I just stared out from behind the blinds, making sure that that creep wasn't sleeping in my truck or stalking me in any way. I didn't see him the rest of the night, but that didn't mean he wasn't around. Who knows? Maybe he got a ride with someone else. Maybe he just wanted to mess with me. Either way, I'd never like to meet that 7-foot-tall phantom ever again. This is gonna sound fake, but I promise you it's not. After graduating college, my oldest brother wanted to spend the weekend camping at Lake Berryessa, outside Napa in California. His girlfriend at the time, Shannon, said we could use her godfather's boat, so we hitched it up, headed up to Spanish Flat to dock. The bank of this lake is surrounded by sandy hills and rocky cliff sides in a bowl valley. It's not exactly easy to climb down in some areas. The landscape has a lot of trees. It's a very big lake, so it's possible to not see anyone around after sunset. People typically will tie up their boats and camp out on the banks. We headed towards the southeast corner, found a nice spot. We swam for over an hour or two and then had dinner. I think it must have been around 7 or maybe 8 p.m. because the sun was setting. The lake was still and beautiful. Shannon suggested we climb up the side of the bank, find some wood for a campfire. So my brother and I climbed up the side trying to find dried pieces. We were far enough into the woods that we could see the boat and the lights. As we were digging around, we heard this sharp, horrifying and echoing scream. We ran to the tree line to find Shannon, who was on the boat and yelling for us, crying and obviously panicked. We climbed down the side slowly. My brother stopped and stared out onto the lake. There's something floating in the water. I looked out and saw something slowly drifting along toward the shoreline. My brother walked toward the boat and told Shannon to come stand over by me. Then he walked to the edge of the lake and just stood there quietly. Shannon ran up to me and was crying. I started to walk over to my brother and he said, "I think it's a skinned animal. It doesn't have any skin." Just as he finishes that sentence, we hear something else. Stumbling footsteps through the shoreline. We turn and we can see a person, a man coming straight at us. Shannon screams again and backs up. My brother and I shoulder to shoulder so we can confront this guy together. He points to the thing in the water and starts clapping his hands together. He asked if we like his handiwork, to which we ask if he did that. He says of course, then says we need to help him fish it out. We tell him no thank you, please exit our day camping area. But it's like he didn't even hear us. He just kept wandering up and down the shore, admiring whatever was in the water. I stood behind him and I could see it. The water was dark, but I could see some detail. It was floating chest down, and there was this big black garbage bag covering the part of the back. It was too big to be a dog or anything. It didn't have a head, and I couldn't see if it had front legs or not. Whatever it was in fact skinned. It drifted slowly, turning as it moved with the current. We stood there for a few moments, didn't say anything, but I knew we were both thinking the same thing. Please don't let that be a person. Shannon suggested we pack up our chairs and get the hell out of there, so we did just that. Now that this whack job showed up, the only safe place was on the boat. We were literally just tossing our stuff up onto the deck, totally careless of the damage, so we clambered up after it and pushed off from the shore. Our new friend was too far away to stop us. He got to us by the time we had the engine going and backed off 20 feet. As we were backing out, I was driving the boat, so I didn't get really a good look, but my brother looked over the edge and tried to get a better description on it. There was blood and other stuff, leaving a pretty steady trail behind it. A cloud so dark, it could have passed for tar. Here's the craziest part. That guy dove in the water and started swimming after us. There's no confusing it. He was barreling right for the side of the boat. There was a small pole ladder in the back, as well as various ropes hanging from the sides, so he could climb up if he got close enough. I really started trying to make some space between us, which deterred the guy, who then chose to swim over to the floating partial corpse. Shannon covered her eyes, was freaking out. We headed back to the dock at Spanish Flat. As we tore off for the other side of the lake, my brother looked back and shouted for us to look too. There was this little dinghy piece of shit coming at us from a little further up the channel. It was small, maybe a 4-person craft, and the guy driving it looked a lot like the guy that we saw on shore. Mangy, disheveled, just weird in general. He brought his little boat around to where the other guy was, and then after that, we lost line of sight. All the more reason to get the hell out of there. Slowly, one breath at a time, we gathered ourselves to make our report. There was an office there for the park department or something, but nobody was there. We waited for quite a while until a lot attendant showed up, but wasn't really a park ranger. We told him that we had a very serious report to make, left our name and number with him. By this time it was getting dark and we really just wanted to leave. We drove to the closest gas station, left a note and number for the clerk to give to any rangers that stopped in. We got a call the next morning and all went in to file the paperwork. It was a quiet ride home. The rangers were completely blown away by what we told them. They said a few others had called in a boat with the exact same description, but they were nowhere to be found. My brother hasn't brought it up in years, but the last time he did, he said he didn't want to make for a guess about what it was. He got a better look than me, but we didn't go back to that lake for another decade or so after. It still upsets me to think about it today.